Let me start with something we can all agree on. Puerto Rico's current status is untenable. 3.2 million American citizens live in a democratic limbo, unable to vote for the president who commands their military, appoints their federal judges, and sets policies that govern their lives. That's not just unfortunate, it's fundamentally un-American. However, where I differ from many of my colleagues is on the solution. Statehood isn't the answer, and here's why. Puerto Rico has repeatedly failed to show a clear, legitimate mandate for statehood. The 2012 referendum was deeply flawed with two confusing questions. The 2017 vote had only 23% turnout because opposition parties boycotted. The 2020 referendum showed 53% for statehood, but that's hardly the overwhelming consensus needed for such a permanent, irreversible change. Beyond the numbers, there's a deeper principle at stake. Many Puerto Ricans value their distinct cultural identity, their Spanish language dominance, and their participation in international sports and cultural events as Puerto Rico, not as the 51st state. Forcing statehood on a divided population would be colonial thinking dressed up as liberation. What we need is enhanced Commonwealth status, a path forward that preserves Puerto Rican identity while granting more autonomy and addressing the democratic deficit through creative constitutional arrangements.
Tom, I appreciate you acknowledging the fundamental injustice of the current situation, but your solution perpetuates exactly the problem you claim to want to solve. There is no such thing as enhanced Commonwealth status under the U.S. Constitution. The Supreme Court has been clear. Territories are possessions of the United States, not equal partners. The creative constitutional arrangements you're suggesting would require a constitutional amendment that would never pass. We can't give Puerto Rico the benefits of statehood, full representation, full federal program access, full constitutional protections, without actually making them a state. That's not how our constitutional system works. You cite divided referendum results, but let's be honest about why those votes were problematic. Congress has never provided a clear, federally sanctioned binding referendum with unambiguous options. The confusion and low turnout you mention are features of a broken process, not evidence that Puerto Ricans don't deserve statehood. When Alaska and Hawaii pursued statehood, Congress took them seriously and provided clear paths forward. Puerto Rico has been asking for over a century. The double standard is obvious and indefensible. If we truly believe in democracy and equal treatment under law, we need to support Puerto Rico's right to full statehood, not invent some second-class citizenship category that keeps them in perpetual limbo.
Lily, you make a valid constitutional argument, and I respect that, but here's what you're not acknowledging. Statehood is permanent and irreversible. Once Puerto Rico becomes a state, there's no going back. That's very different from what Alaska and Hawaii faced. They were far more culturally aligned with the mainland United States. Puerto Rico is a Caribbean island with a centuries-old Hispanic culture, Spanish as the dominant language, and a distinct national identity that many residents fiercely protect. Pushing for immediate statehood without an overwhelming, undeniable mandate risks creating a state full of citizens who never wanted that status. However, and this is important, I'm not suggesting we maintain the status quo indefinitely. What I'm proposing is that we actually listen to Puerto Rican voices comprehensively. Instead of a simple binary choice that Congress imposes, let's have a properly structured referendum that includes all options: statehood, independence, free association similar to what Palau or the Marshall Islands have, and yes, an enhanced version of the current Commonwealth relationship. Let Puerto Ricans themselves decide their future with full information about what each option actually means in practice. Then, and only then, Congress should commit to honoring whatever choice receives a true supermajority, say 60% or more. That's democratic self-determination, not colonial imposition.
Tom, now we're actually getting somewhere productive. Your proposal for a comprehensive referendum with multiple options, that's something I can work with, and it addresses some of my concerns about respecting Puerto Rican self-determination. But we need to be careful about a few things. First, that 60% supermajority threshold you mentioned, could actually entrench the status quo indefinitely if votes are split among 4 options. No option might ever reach 60% if support is fragmented. Second, we can't include options that aren't constitutionally viable. The Supreme Court has repeatedly said there's no such thing as enhanced commonwealth that gives territory benefits without statehood obligations. Including that option would be offering something we can't deliver that's more dishonest than leaving it off the ballot. Here's what I'd propose instead: a 2-stage process. Stage 1, a simple up or down vote on the current territorial status. Should Puerto Rico remain a territory? If the majority says no, then Stage 2 presents the legitimate alternatives: statehood, independence, or free association. Each option comes with a detailed, congressionally approved explanation of what it means for citizenship, federal benefits, taxation, military service, international relations, everything. The winner of Stage 2, with a simple majority, gets implemented. This respects self-determination while ensuring Puerto Ricans choose from real, deliverable options. And critically, Congress must commit up front to honoring the result, not treating it as another advisory opinion they can ignore.
Lily, your 2-stage process is genuinely thoughtful, and I appreciate you acknowledging the need for detailed information about each option. That addresses the confusion that plagued past referendums. However, I have concerns about the framing of Stage 1. Asking, should Puerto Rico remain a territory, with a simple yes-no creates a negative framing that could artificially inflate support for change, without corresponding agreement on what that change should be. People might vote no on territorial status for completely different reasons, some wanting statehood, others wanting independence, and then we're in Stage 2 with a fractured electorate and no clear mandate for any single path. Here's a better approach. Combine our ideas. One comprehensive ballot with all legitimate options clearly defined, but use ranked choice voting. Puerto Ricans rank their preferences, and we use instant runoff until one option has a true majority. This ensures the winning choice isn't just tolerated by a plurality, but is actually preferred by a majority when compared to alternatives. For the options themselves, I'll concede your constitutional point on enhanced commonwealth. If it's not legally viable, we shouldn't offer it. But independence and free association absolutely must be on the ballot alongside statehood. And here's something else we need: a minimum turnout threshold of 55%. If the legitimacy question plagued past votes, requiring majority participation ensures the result truly represents the will of Puerto Rican people, not just the most motivated faction.
Tom, ranked choice voting is brilliant. It solves exactly the problem I was worried about with vote splitting and ensures we get a true majority preference. I can fully support that mechanism. And you're right that independence and free association need to be legitimate options on the ballot. My goal isn't to predetermine the outcome. It's to ensure the process is fair and the result is binding. The turnout threshold makes sense too, though 55% might be high, given that U.S. presidential elections rarely hit that number. Maybe we set it at 50% turnout with at least 55% of votes cast going to the winning option after ranked choice tabulation. That ensures both broad participation and a clear mandate. But here's what we absolutely must add to make this work: federal funding for a massive civic education campaign, not propaganda for any particular option, but genuinely neutral information about what each choice means in practice. How would taxation work? What happens to U.S. citizenship? Federal benefits? Economic development funds? Military bases? Each option needs a clear, detailed transition plan developed by nonpartisan experts and approved by Congress before the vote. Puerto Ricans deserve to make this choice with their eyes wide open, not based on campaign promises or political rhetoric. And one more critical piece: Congress must pass enabling legislation before the referendum that explicitly commits to implementing whichever option wins. No more advisory referendums that Congress can ignore. This has to be binding, or we're just perpetuating the same disrespect that's defined Puerto Rico's relationship with the mainland for over a century.
Lily, before we finalize the referendum structure, we need to address the elephant in the room: economics. Any honest discussion about Puerto Rico's status must confront the fiscal reality. Puerto Rico has a $70 billion debt crisis, chronic budget deficits, and an economy that's been contracting for over a decade. The island receives approximately $22 billion annually in federal transfers, Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, nutritional assistance, while contributing only about $4 billion in federal taxes. As a state, Puerto Rico would likely become the poorest state in the Union, with a per capita income about half the current poorest state, Mississippi. The federal government would face massive new obligations, full Medicaid expansion, increased Medicare payments, SSI benefits that territories don't currently receive. We're talking about tens of billions in additional annual federal spending. Now, I'm not saying Puerto Rico doesn't deserve equal treatment, but Americans need to understand what statehood actually costs. And Puerto Ricans need to understand that statehood means full federal income taxation, which many residents don't currently pay. That's not a small detail. It's a fundamental transformation of their economic reality. Any referendum must include detailed, transparent economic projections for each status option so voters understand what they're actually choosing.
Tom, thank you for bringing actual numbers to this conversation. That's exactly the kind of honesty we need. But let's put those numbers in full context. Yes, Puerto Rico receives significant federal transfers. But you know why? Because territorial status has created economic conditions that require those transfers. Puerto Rico can't access the same economic development tools states use. They can't offer the same tax incentives. They can't participate fully in federal programs that drive economic growth. The Jones Act forces them to use expensive U.S. shipping for all goods, artificially inflating costs by an estimated $1.5 to $3 billion annually. They're hit by federal minimum wage requirements despite having much lower cost of living and productivity levels than the mainland. The territory status itself is economically crippling. As for the debt crisis, much of that stems from unclear legal status that led to predatory lending and financial manipulation that states would never tolerate. Regarding your point about costs, yes, statehood requires federal investment, but that investment pays returns. States receive federal support and contribute economic growth, innovation, and productivity. Look at the poorest states. They receive more in federal funds than they contribute in taxes, and we don't question their statehood. Puerto Rico would have approximately 5 electoral votes and 2 senators. They'd have actual political power to advocate for their interests instead of begging Congress for crumbs. That political representation could transform their economic policy and development trajectory. But you're absolutely right about one thing. The referendum must include honest economic projections for all options, including the long-term economic costs of continued territorial status, which are substantial and often invisible.
Lily, those are fair points, and I appreciate you acknowledging the need for economic honesty. You're right that territorial status itself creates economic disadvantages. The Jones Act is a perfect example of how Puerto Rico gets the worst of both worlds. They face federal constraints without federal benefits. And your comparison to poor states is valid. We don't revoke Mississippi's statehood because they receive more federal funds than they contribute. That said, here's where I think we need to be innovative. Whatever status Puerto Ricans choose, we need transition provisions that prevent economic shock. If they choose statehood, we can't just flip a switch and impose full federal income taxes immediately while their economy is still recovering. Phase in taxation over, say, 10 years, with corresponding phase-in of full federal benefits. If they choose independence or free association, we need multi-year agreements that maintain economic stability while they establish their own system. Think of it like the transition plans the EU developed when countries joined or left. We should also, and this is important regardless of status outcome, finally repeal or reform the Jones Act as it applies to Puerto Rico. That economic burden is indefensible and costs them billions. And we need to settle the debt crisis through a fair restructuring process, not continuing to saddle the island with impossible obligations. These economic security provisions should be part of the referendum package so voters know they're not voting for economic catastrophe under any option.
Tom, now we're building something genuinely workable. Your transition provisions are exactly right. Nobody wants economic shock therapy. whether we're talking about statehood or any other status change. A phased approach to taxation and benefits makes practical sense and would probably be essential for passing any legislation through Congress anyway. Both parties could support that as responsible governance. And I'm thrilled you're willing to tackle the Jones Act. That's been an economic anchor around Puerto Rico's neck for a century, and it's time for it to go. Here's what I'd add to make the economic package complete. Regardless of which status wins, we commit to a 10-year economic development fund specifically for Puerto Rico. If they choose statehood, this fund accelerates infrastructure modernization, educational investment, and business development so they can compete on equal footing with other states. If they choose independence or free association, this fund provides runway for economic transition and establishing their own systems. We're talking maybe $5 to $7 billion annually, substantial but manageable within the federal budget, especially when you consider we're already spending $22 billion yearly on current programs. This isn't charity. It's smart investment in either a new state's success or a stable, prosperous neighbor in the Caribbean. We should also commit to trade preferences if Puerto Rico chooses independence or free association, maintaining economic ties even while respecting political sovereignty. That way, no option leads to economic collapse, and voters can make their choice based on democratic and cultural values, not just fear of poverty.
Lily, we've made real progress on the mechanics and economics of a referendum, but we need to address something that goes deeper than policy: cultural identity and sovereignty. For many Puerto Ricans, their cultural distinctiveness isn't just a nice feature, it's fundamental to who they are. They compete as Puerto Rico in the Olympics, in Miss Universe, in international baseball. Their national identity is expressed through their own participation in world culture, not as Americans, but as Puerto Ricans. Spanish isn't just a language they speak, it's the dominant language of daily life, education, business, and governance. Under statehood, would they have to make English the official language? Would they lose their ability to compete internationally as Puerto Rico? These aren't trivial concerns. They're about collective identity and dignity. Some worry that statehood would lead to cultural assimilation. The Puerto Rican culture would gradually dissolve into generic American culture, the way some fear happened to native Hawaiian culture after statehood. Now, I understand your argument that they can maintain their culture as a state. Louisiana has maintained Cajun culture. New Mexico has strong Hispanic heritage. But those states were never sovereign cultural entities the way Puerto Rico has been for centuries. The fear of cultural loss is real and legitimate, and any status change must address it directly. We need explicit protections. Spanish as an official language with equal status to English, guarantees for continued participation in international cultural and sporting events under their own flag, protection for their distinct legal system based on Spanish civil law tradition. Without these safeguards, we're asking Puerto Ricans to gamble their entire cultural heritage on promises that might not be kept.
Tom, I'm genuinely glad you're taking cultural concerns seriously, because they matter deeply, and any solution that dismisses them will fail. But I want to challenge one thing. This idea that statehood inherently threatens Puerto Rican culture assumes that American identity is monolithic and assimilationist, and that's simply not true anymore. America is a multicultural democracy where distinct cultural identities thrive within a shared political framework. Yes, Louisiana and New Mexico maintained their heritage, but more importantly, they shaped American culture in the process. Cajun and Tex-Mex culture aren't just preserved, they're vibrant and influential parts of American identity. Puerto Rico wouldn't have to become less Puerto Rican. America would become more Puerto Rican. That said, I completely support your proposed protections. Spanish as an official language with equal legal status? Absolutely, and there's precedent. New Mexico's constitution provides for bilingual government. Continued Olympic participation? That requires negotiation with international sports federations, but Hawaii was allowed a transition period for some international competitions, so there's flexibility. Protection for civil law traditions? Several states maintain distinct legal systems, like Louisiana's Civil Code. These are reasonable, achievable protections that could be written into the Statehood Admission Act. But here's what I want Puerto Ricans to consider. Right now, They have no power to protect their culture from federal interference. As a territory, Congress can impose any law on Puerto Rico without their consent. As a state, they'd have 2 senators and 5 representatives who could fight for their interests. They'd have constitutional protections that territories don't fully enjoy. They'd have actual sovereignty within the federal system, the same sovereignty that has allowed Louisiana to protect Cajun culture and New Mexico to maintain its Spanish heritage. Statehood might actually be the strongest protection for Puerto Rican culture because it provides real political power.
Lily, that's a powerful argument about political power protecting culture, and I think you're right that statehood could provide stronger safeguards than territorial status currently does. I'm willing to concede that my fears about cultural assimilation might be overstated if we build in the right protections from the start. Here's where I think we can find common ground. The referendum materials must explicitly address cultural concerns and detail exactly what protections would be included in any status change. If statehood wins, the Admission Act must include specific provisions guaranteeing Spanish language rights, protecting Puerto Rico's civil law system, and ensuring continued cultural distinctiveness. These can't be vague promises. They need to be legally binding constitutional commitments. Similarly, if independence or free association wins, the transition agreement must include cultural cooperation provisions, allowing for continued educational exchanges, cultural programs, people-to-people connections that maintain the relationships built over a century. We should also address this. Whatever status emerges, Puerto Rico should be guaranteed the right to determine its own cultural and educational policies without federal interference beyond constitutional basics. States have significant autonomy over education and cultural matters, and Puerto Rico should have that same autonomy, or even greater autonomy if they choose free association. What I'm realizing through this conversation is that maybe the real question isn't will statehood destroy Puerto Rican culture, but rather, what specific protections do we need to ensure it doesn't? And that's a question we can actually answer with good policy design.
Tom, I think we've just made a crucial breakthrough. You're absolutely right that specific, legally binding cultural protections need to be part of any status legislation, not afterthoughts or assumptions. And your point about educational and cultural autonomy is critical. Puerto Rico should have more control over its cultural institutions, not less, regardless of which status option they choose. Let me build on what you said. In the referendum materials, we include a detailed appendix to each status option that specifically addresses cultural questions. For statehood, we spell out exactly what the Admission Act would contain: official bilingual status with Spanish and English having equal legal standing in all government functions, protection for Puerto Rico's participation in international cultural and sporting events under negotiated arrangements, preservation of their civil law traditions, and explicit autonomy over educational curriculum and cultural policy. For independence, we detail what cultural cooperation agreements would look like, continued Fulbright exchanges, sister city programs, cultural diplomacy initiatives. For free association, we explain how Palau and the Marshall Islands have maintained their distinct cultural identities while having special relationships with the U.S. This way, Puerto Ricans aren't voting blind on cultural questions. They can see exactly how their culture would be protected under each option. And you know what? This transparency might actually reduce some of the fear that's paralyzed this debate for decades. When people see that serious, specific protections are on offer, they might feel more comfortable choosing based on democratic principles rather than cultural fear. The goal is that someone could proudly vote for statehood without feeling they're betraying Puerto Rican identity, or vote for independence without fearing they're abandoning economic security. Each option becomes legitimate and dignified.
Lily, we've built a strong framework, but we need to address the credibility problem directly. Puerto Ricans have voted on their status multiple times, and nothing ever changes. The 2012 referendum had that confusing two-question format that opponents claimed was designed to manufacture a pro-statehood result. The 2017 vote was boycotted by status quo supporters, resulting in that 23% turnout that made the results meaningless. Even the 2020 referendum with 53% for statehood was dismissed by many as just another non-binding opinion poll that Congress would ignore. Each failed referendum doesn't just fail, it makes the next one harder because it breeds cynicism. Puerto Ricans increasingly believe that no matter how they vote, Washington doesn't care, and nothing will change. That cynicism is the real enemy of resolution. We have to break that pattern, and that means several things. First, Congress must pass binding enabling legislation before the referendum, not after. This legislation explicitly commits to implementing whichever option wins. No more advisory votes. Second, the referendum must be administered by a neutral federal commission, not by Puerto Rican political parties that have obvious preferences. Third, we need international observers, maybe from the UN or OAS, to verify the process is fair and the results are legitimate. Fourth, both political parties in Congress need to make public commitments to honor the results before the vote happens. If Republicans and Democrats both state on record that they'll support implementing whatever Puerto Rico chooses, that creates political accountability. Without these credibility measures, we're just setting up another failed referendum that increases cynicism and pushes resolution even further into the future.
Tom, every single credibility measure you just described is absolutely essential, and I support all of them without reservation. The binding enabling legislation passed before the vote, that's non-negotiable. We cannot ask Puerto Ricans to vote again without first proving Congress is serious. And you're right that neutral administration is critical. The Puerto Rican Electoral Commission has done good work on local elections, but for a status referendum, we need federal administration to remove any appearance of partisan manipulation. International observers are a brilliant addition. If the UN and OAS certify the process as free and fair, that removes the legitimacy questions that plagued past votes. But let me add a few more elements to ensure this referendum is truly definitive. We need a mandatory cooling-off period. Once Congress passes the enabling legislation, we wait 6 months before holding the referendum. That gives time for the civic education campaign we discussed, for community deliberation, for people to genuinely understand their options. No rush job where people vote without full information. We should also establish an independent dispute resolution mechanism. If there are challenges to the results or implementation, they go to a special tribunal, maybe a panel of retired federal judges that can quickly resolve them, rather than letting disputes drag on in courts for years. And here's something crucial. We set a specific timeline for implementation. If statehood wins, Congress commits to passing admission legislation within 18 months. If independence or free association wins, negotiations begin immediately with a target of 3 years for full transition. These deadlines create accountability and prevent congressional foot-dragging. Finally, we make one absolute commitment. This is the final referendum. Once Puerto Rico makes a clear choice in a process this robust, that decision stands. No do-overs, no buyer's remorse votes every few years. Puerto Rico gets self-determination, but self-determination means living with the choice you make. That finality actually helps people take the decision seriously.
Lily, your additions are exactly right. That 6-month cooling-off period is essential. We can't have a situation where Congress passes legislation in June and expects Puerto Ricans to make a century-defining decision by August. People need time to deliberate, to attend community meetings like we're showing, to read the materials, to discuss with their families. And the dispute resolution mechanism prevents the nightmare scenario where the referendum succeeds, but implementation gets tied up in litigation for a decade. The specific timeline with deadlines is crucial too. It prevents Congress from honoring the letter of the commitment while violating its spirit through endless delays. I want to add one more element to address the credibility gap. Key congressional leaders from both parties should visit Puerto Rico during the 6-month education period, not to campaign for any particular option, but to personally assure Puerto Ricans that Congress will honor the results. When the Senate Majority Leader, the Speaker of the House, the chairs of relevant committees from both parties, all make public statements in San Juan that they're committed to implementation, that carries weight. It also creates political cover for moderates in both parties, who might otherwise be nervous about whatever option wins. Now, on your point about finality, I partially agree, but with one caveat. I support the idea that this referendum, if properly conducted with all these safeguards, should be treated as determinative and not relitigated for at least a generation. But we can't literally prevent Puerto Ricans from changing their minds forever. If they choose independence and then 30 years later a new generation wants to reconsider, they should be able to petition for that. What we can say is, this referendum, conducted with these extraordinary protections and this level of federal commitment, represents a clear, legitimate democratic choice that won't be second-guessed or reversed quickly. There's a difference between preventing buyer's remorse votes every 5 years versus recognizing that future generations have democratic rights too.
Tom, your caveat about future generations is fair and wise. You're right that we can't bind Puerto Rico forever. Self-determination includes the right of future generations to revisit fundamental questions if circumstances dramatically change. So let's say this. The referendum is final and definitive for a minimum of 25 years. That's a generation, long enough to give the chosen status a genuine chance to succeed or fail, long enough to prevent constant agitation for do-over votes, but not so long that we're imposing the will of today's voters on their grandchildren forever. After 25 years, if 20% of Puerto Rican registered voters petition for a new status referendum, Congress commits to considering it. That balances finality with democratic flexibility. And yes, absolutely, congressional leaders visiting Puerto Rico during the education period is perfect. Not to advocate, just to show respect and commitment. The mere act of congressional leaders taking Puerto Rico seriously enough to visit, to listen, to make public commitments, that would itself be historic and meaningful. Here's one final element I think we need: a Citizens Oversight Commission. Once the referendum passes and implementation begins, we create a commission with Puerto Rican appointees from various political perspectives, mainland congressional appointees, and independent experts. This commission monitors the implementation process and reports quarterly to Congress and the Puerto Rican people on progress toward fulfilling commitments. If the implementation is lagging, they sound the alarm. This keeps both governments accountable throughout what could be a years-long transition. Tom, I think we've actually designed a process that could work, not just theoretically but practically. A process that learns from every past failure and addresses every legitimate concern. A process that respects Puerto Rican self-determination while being honest about constitutional and economic realities. Most importantly, a process that's credible enough that Puerto Ricans might actually trust it.
Lily, let me summarize what we've agreed on, because I think we've genuinely built something unprecedented here. A complete framework for Puerto Rico's self-determination that addresses every major concern that's blocked progress for over a century. First, the referendum structure. Congress passes binding enabling legislation that explicitly commits to implementing whichever option wins. The ballot includes statehood, independence, and free association, each with comprehensive documentation. We use ranked choice voting to ensure a true majority preference. We require 50% voter turnout and 55% support for the winning option after tabulation. Second, the process safeguards neutral federal administration, international observers, a 6-month civic education period with federally funded nonpartisan information campaigns. Congressional leaders from both parties visit Puerto Rico and publicly commit to honoring results. Third, the substantive provisions. Detailed economic transition plans including phased tax implementation, Jones Act reform, debt restructuring, and a 10-year economic development fund. Specific cultural protections, including official bilingual status, continued international participation, protection of legal traditions, and educational autonomy. Clear timelines: 18 months for statehood admission legislation or 3 years for independence transition. Fourth, accountability measures. A Citizens Oversight Commission monitoring implementation, an independent dispute resolution tribunal, and a 25-year finality provision with democratic flexibility after that. Fifth, our shared commitment to honesty. The referendum materials include transparent economic projections, frank discussions of trade-offs, and specific answers to cultural questions. No false promises, no scare tactics, just respect for Puerto Rican intelligence and dignity. This framework doesn't predetermine the outcome. It could lead to statehood, independence, or free association. What it does is ensure that whatever Puerto Ricans choose, they do so with full information, genuine options, and absolute certainty that their choice will be implemented. That's real self-determination.
Tom, that's a beautiful summary of our framework, and I want to add what this means for real people, the benefits that will flow from finally resolving this question. First and most fundamental, democratic dignity. For the first time in over a century, Puerto Ricans will make a free choice about their political future, and that choice will be honored. 3.2 million Americans will no longer be second-class citizens in their own country. They'll either have full representation as a state, or they'll have full sovereignty as an independent nation or freely associated state. Either way, they'll have control over their own destiny. Second, economic opportunity. Whatever status they choose, the transition provisions and development funding give Puerto Rico the tools to build a prosperous future. If they choose statehood, they get full access to federal programs, political power to advocate for their interests, and economic integration with the mainland. If they choose independence or free association, they get economic development support and trade preferences that provide stability during transition. The Jones Act reform alone could save billions annually. Third, cultural security. The specific protections we've built in mean Puerto Ricans don't have to choose between their identity and their future. They can be both fully Puerto Rican and fully part of whatever political arrangement they prefer. Spanish language rights, cultural institutions, international participation, these are guaranteed, not left to chance. Fourth, political accountability. The oversight mechanisms ensure that promises made will be promises kept. No more advisory referendums that get ignored. No more congressional neglect. Both Puerto Rico and the mainland United States will be held accountable for following through on the chosen path. Fifth, and perhaps most important, hope. Right now, Puerto Rico exists in a frustrating limbo that depresses economic investment, drives immigration, and saps civic energy. Resolution means Puerto Rico can finally move forward. Businesses will invest because they know what the rules are. Young people will stay because they see a future. Communities will thrive because they're not trapped in permanent uncertainty. Whether Puerto Rico becomes the 51st state, an independent nation, or a freely associated state, they'll finally be writing their own story instead of waiting for someone else to write it for them. This framework respects Puerto Rico enough to let them choose, commits to supporting whatever they choose, and ensures that choice becomes reality. That's not just good policy, it's justice, it's democracy, and it's long overdue.